Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of Intellectual Conversations. It's been a while since we've had a professor on. I've been busy, they've been busy, and today we're joined by Professor Brook Ziporyn, who is the professor of Chinese religion, philosophy, and comparative thought at the University of Chicago Divinity School. So, welcome, Brook. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Jason. I'm very happy to be here. Looking forward to the
Yeah,
conversation.
yeah. So I came across Brook about 5 years ago. I was doing some research into Spinoza, and I came across an article that mentioned that Brook had been doing some work into Buddhism and Spinoza, and we exchanged a couple of conversations. And then recently, over the last few months, we've really been engaging with each other a lot more. And so I wanted to have him come on. I've read a couple of his books. Um, and so I thought, okay, now is a great time to come on and actually talk about what he's been doing. So just pull up my notes here. So Chinese philosophy, I mean, that and you speak Mandarin, you speak and read and write Mandarin. So that's kind of unusual. So was there something in your youth that got you interested in Chinese culture? It's kind of an unusual field for a Westerner to dive into and make a career out of.
Uh, well, actually, yeah, I began to be interested in Chinese thought really quite randomly. I mean, I was a teenager when I first encountered a translation of the Tao Te Ching. And this was not because I had any special interest in China or the Tao Te Ching. I just was, a bored teenager and restless and would pick up things randomly. But that translation really piqued my interest as something that was clearly unlike anything else I had ever read. And I mean, for several reasons in retrospect, I guess I'd say it was the way it handled negative values like non-doing or retreat or stillness, things that were not normally, or even a kind of ethical skepticism that's apparent in that book, sort of warnings of the danger of a kind of moral fanaticism or a duality of good and evil, and a certain kind of paradoxical way of expressing itself. So, of course, I found it very mysterious. I found it very difficult. I found it sort of incomprehensible, but really fascinating, and it spoke to me in some way. It got me interested enough to start. I looked also, I managed to find a Zhuangzi translation, the other great Taoist classic. But also the Tao Te Ching was so intriguing and sort of opaque to me, and yet resonant, that I found a bunch of other translations, when I could. Sorry about that. And they were so different, they were so ridiculously different. There are more translations of the Tao Te Ching really than any other book except the Bible, but there are more just in English than there are of the Bible or of any other book. In other words, there are hundreds and hundreds of different translations. Now there's one by me in English, and they're all very evidently, the minute you take a look at them, they're so crazily divergent. And that got me interested in the language, the Chinese language, the classical Chinese language, because I didn't really have any interest in modern China or even in learning modern Chinese. I really just wanted to understand how these could be different translations of the same book, because it just seemed so counterintuitive. And when I found out a little more about the classical Chinese language, and I learned, it has these odd features. It doesn't have a lot of the grammatical features that Indo-European languages have. The ways of disambiguating nouns and verbs and adjectives, and no singular and plural, and no past, present, future tense, and no declensions or conjugations, anything like that. And so, when you hear about that, you're like, well, how can that even work to make sense, right? How can communication even take place in the absence of all these sort of specifiers and disambiguators? And so when I got interested in the language, then then started to read a little more kind of Tao Te Ching, Taoism, Zhuangzi adjacent stuff in English, I eventually decided when I went to college that I could never really understand this unless I learned this language and sort of figured out how it worked. Unlike anything else I could do in college. In other words, how would I want to spend my time? You know, you can read 5 translations of maybe Dostoevsky or something, and you kind of feel like, okay, they're different. The style, the feeling is different, but I understand they're all talking at least about the same subject matter and making the same points, most of the time. So I really don't have to learn Russian to sort of understand Dostoevsky or Tolstoy or something. But I did feel like if I want to understand Taoism, I had to learn classical Chinese. So that was the initial motivation. And then once I got into it, of course, so many other things, so much has not been translated into English, right, that you suddenly have access to. And that really just expanded from there, and turned into a lifestyle. Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned, so without going too deep into it, so you've got a book on mystical atheism that talks about Taoism and other influences. But I noticed you never really talked about the Tao Te Ching in that book. It's much more on Zhuangzi. Is the Tao Te Ching not really? I mean, if I read it like 30 years ago in a world religions class. But is there something about the Tao Te Ching that just doesn't lend itself to the topics you were discussing in your book on mystical atheism that Zhuangzi is much more relevant to?
Well, that's a great question. There is a bit on the Tao Te Ching, right, in the sort of introduction to the Taoism section. But you're right that I pretty quickly transitioned more into sort of the Zhuangzi, and I do think Zhuangzi is. It's not that it's more relevant, but that it delves a little deeper and develops things more intricately in a way that helped dialogue for this book. I mean, there's a fair amount on the Tao Te Ching, but in fact, I mean, this book has Taoism in the title, and I mean, because the specific topic is wu wei, non-doing, and purposelessness, and mystical atheism. It's only certain aspects of those Taoist texts that I'm trying to work with here. I have a lot more to say about both the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi. Most of that is contained in other books or in the translation of the Zhuangzi that I did, which I try work out an interpretation of sort of globally of Taoism in all of its facets, or Zhuangism, as some people now call it, or various versions of Zhuangism, things going on in those books. So it gets complicated because the texts are complicated and they have many layers and different streams. And I really just wanted to extract a few motifs that could interface with the sort of Western thinkers like Spinoza and Nietzsche and Bataille that I wanted to talk about.
Okay. Yeah, because it didn't really hit me until after I'd finished reading it that you never really talked much about Lao Tzu and the Tao Te Ching. It was much more focused on Tiantai Buddhism and Zhuangzi. So I just made the assumption that there was much more in Zhuangzi. So that is much more relatable to the topic of the book. So okay.
To some extent, I mean this sort of basic paradigm shift away from purpose to purposelessness, you definitely find in the Tao Te Ching. But the Tao Te Ching is a kind of very special sort of text, and it's written in a way that is very indirect and elusive and evocative. So you can do lots of things with it, but it wasn't the sort of the key kind of doctrinal, ideological, or conceptual support for this kind of a discussion.
Yeah. It's like I studied Taoism. I took a world religions class in university as an elective, and I remember studying Taoism, but I don't really remember much about it. I remember more about the Buddhism, and what was really fascinating was like the North American, the Native American nature religions like that.
Yeah.
I found that was really, really interesting. But the Taoism never really stuck with me. And even like I've read Tao of Pooh probably like 3, 4 times, but like it never really sunk in. And then when I read your book, I'm like, hey, okay, now I this idea of purpose and non-purpose. Okay, now I'm really starting to see the appeal of this philosophy.
I
And
see. Yeah.
why.
Yeah,
What
I
what
mean, because as I said, the Tao Te Ching is so ambiguous. I mean, that's almost its whole point. I would argue, in a way, right? It is non-coercive in the way it communicates meaning, and it doesn't, it's almost a principled refraining from being definite about its meaning. So, if you have a college class on Taoism, or you pick up a popular book on Taoism, you're going to get one person's or one stream of the tradition's way of dealing with that ambiguity. That's why the Zhuangzi gives you a lot more kind of specific things you can work with in certain kinds of philosophical discussions. But what is Taoism? What is the Tao Te Ching? What is it even claiming? Those are still very controversial. So anyone who studies the Tao Te Ching, there's 50 other Tao Te Chings. It's all the
Right.
same book, but it can be interpreted in so many of these different ways.
Right. And on Zhuangzi, so I tried to sort it out, but I couldn't really get my head around it. So maybe you can explain. So both Zhuangzhou and Zhuangzi, they seem to be used interchangeably, both to
Yes.
refer to the book and the author. Is that correct?
Zhuangzhou is the name of the putative historical figure who traditionally is considered the author of this 33 chapter work called the Zhuangzi. It sometimes has other kind of nicknames in Chinese. It's called the Nanhua Zhenjing, or the true classic of the flowering of the South, but modern scholarship has cast a lot of doubt on the authorship claims of most classical Chinese texts, but especially the Zhuangzi. And so, in modern English, if you see the word Zhuangzi and it's italicized, that means the book Zhuangzi. You don't call the book Zhuangzhou, though. Zhuangzhou is the name of a person.
Okay.
But whether he is the author of that book or some part of that book, or those are all highly contentious historical.
Speculative, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I because I looked at a couple of different sources and they seem to use both interchangeably. So I wasn't really sure what was going on there. So
And
the, the
Zhuangzhou, sometimes called Zhuangzhou or Zhou, and Zhuangzi show up in the Zhuangzi book as characters. So that's another
okay.
implication,
So maybe that's part of the conflation. So okay. And one of the other and so in your book on mystical atheism, and we'll in the link we'll have a link to Brooks, not only his book on Amazon, but also his webpage at the University of Chicago, where he has some supplementary materials. So in your book, you weren't just looking at the Zhuangzi. You were looking at Tiantai Buddhism and Nietzsche and Spinoza. And one of the things I was having this idea in the back of my head, and then you eventually answered it, is I was curious as to how much Tiantai Buddhism was influenced by Buddhism. And then you actually got to that point later in the book. So maybe you can just briefly
Oh, yeah.
just give us an explanation of how they're related.
This is, I taught as recently in Taiwan, and I'm collaborating with a scholar there working on this very topic. In other words, the influence specifically of Zhuangzi, or things in the Zhuangzi, certain conceptual moves in the Zhuangzi on Chinese Buddhism, and in particular this school of Tiantai. And I've sort of specialized in Tiantai Buddhism for many years, and I would say my most sort of involved theoretical philosophical works are working on Tiantai specifically. So, I mean, when I've done monographs or just pure philosophical speculation, I have some of those things I mentioned from the Tao Te Ching, the interest in paradox and paradoxical thinking, particularly value paradox. This is a thing that you don't see in early Buddhism. You do start to see in Mahayana Buddhism in India, right? These claims that like samsara is nirvana. seemingly very counterintuitive or even paradoxical claims. And these come into China and they start to get interpreted in terms of indigenous ways of thought, which had worked out their own ways of thinking the coincidence of seeming opposite, particularly value opposites, good and bad, purposive and purposeless, things like this. And so while you will not find an avowed influence, so when the Buddhism sort of became established in China, it was at pains to distinguish itself from Taoism and from Confucianism. And so it would sometimes say, well, sometimes those early Taoist texts got things right, but it was sort of random and just by chance. They didn't really have the Buddha Dharma that gave them, this sort of strict logical way of proceeding to reach these ideas. But if you look at Chinese Buddhism, and particularly Tiantai compared to Tibetan Buddhism or Indian Buddhist texts, you start to see some really important differences develop. And so, yes, I think that the really distinctive things in Tiantai and the things that are of special importance to me are a kind of a meeting of these cultural, very, very different cultural sort of complexes, right? I mean, I was mentioning Indo-European linguistic systems and Chinese linguistic systems. This is kind of the first time in history these two massive, very literate, already very quite well developed philosophical worlds collide, as it were, in Chinese Buddhism. And so you get these really fascinating developments over the centuries, and very, sort of pinnacle philosophically for me is the Tiantai school. I see a conceptual continuity with some of the most radical moves we find in the Zhuangzi to some of the most radical moves, most unlike Indian Buddhism moves, and most of Western philosophy as well, unlike that, in this confluence of this radical edge in the Zhuangzi and this sort of radical edge in Mahayana Buddhism, that sort of this synergy or this kind of, explosive combination happens in Tiantai.
Yeah. So there very much is a Taoist influence in Tiantai that does shine through. Yeah.
I'd say so, but it's not something you can prove, and it's not something everyone, I mean, you understand that real sort of confessional Buddhists are at pains to say, no, this comes straight from the Buddha. It's not some weird Chinese Taoist thing that like seeped in and polluted the Buddha Dharma. So, there's a kind of an agenda on either side, then sort of apologists for Chinese sort of cultural strength will want to say, it's very Chinese, it really is. It's so, you got to be a little careful with all those claims. Historically, there's, you're doing this purely on philosophical grounds. There are really specific kinds of ways of dealing conceptually with certain types of philosophical problems that are distinctive, but, they definitely are transformed due to this encounter. Yeah, I put it like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was pretty clear reading through your book that when you were talking about Tiantai, that there were clearly some Taoist elements that had made it in there. The other issue, so the article I mentioned, so the article that I came across your name, it was about your article. Please correct me if I get it. The self-overcoming of solipsism. Is that right? Did I get that right?
Yeah, that's right. In Spinoza.
Yeah, you mentioned in that article you were talking about Huayan Buddhism, but you didn't really talk about that in your book on the mysticism. So it was much more on the Tian. So was that much because Tian? And so I asked ChatGPT. Let me just actually pull it up. I asked ChatGPT, and it said, compare Tiantai and Huayan, and it says, so the central text of Tiantai is the Lotus Sutra, which is in your appendix, which was just blew my mind, which you and I were emailing about that earlier in the week. I was reading the Lotus Sutra, and it was like just, my head was exploding. And it says the method is much more meditative, whereas Huayan is much more metaphysical with cosmological elaboration. So would you agree with that summary?
Not exactly. Okay, so I mean, this is a bit of a can of worms. I'll try to be brief. Tiantai is the first what really, usually people say really Sinicized original Chinese Buddhist theoretical school. So the founder of Tiantai creates this massive system for interpreting Buddhist texts. And it does involve, yes, it focuses on the Lotus Sutra and a few other very important sources, Nagarjuna, the Madhyamaka thinker, the Nirvana Sutra, the Vimalakirti, a bunch of sutras. And it develops its own very unique system, okay? And it's very complicated and it's very intricate. Among the ideas that are developed there is this idea of interpenetration or interperversion. And this is something that comes up in Buddhist sutras, like the Avatamsaka, the Huayan Sutra, which becomes the central sutra of the Huayan school, where it says these weird things like, millions of universes in every speck of dust, right? And like this idea of Indra's net. You were talking about the Tao of physics earlier. This is a favorite trope there, right? Which is this idea that there's this net in the where every node, every intersection, there's a jewel, and each jewel reflects all the other jewels. In some sense, all things are present in each thing. The world in a grain of sand, kind of an idea, like William Blake. That's evoked poetically in the sutras, and it has something to do with traditional emptiness theory. It's connected to that, but it's not worked out theoretically. In Indian Buddhism, philosophically, the sutras are one thing, and then the treatises, the shastras, are where the actual kind of philosophical reasoning and argument go on. They don't really take up this idea of interpenetration. I call it omnicentrism, right? Which is this idea that, basically each specific concrete thing, part of the whole, seemingly, is really the whole. And we have an sort of infinite array of different versions, each of which is the entire universe, okay? And, and that was developed in Tiantai for a specific kind of soteriological purpose, which had to do with the relation between Buddhahood and delusion. So, the sutra, I'm trying to be brief, but I'll finish this soon. But the idea that, well, these things interpenetrate. Things don't have a definite self nature. So, I say this is a pen as if there's an essence and a definite sort of entity here that excludes every other entity. But if all entities are empty of self nature, does that mean this is really kind of a blank? Or does that mean every other kind of determination I could think of is equally applicable to this thing? And this goes for you and me, and this goes for my delusions and my greed, anger, and illusion, and Buddhahood, right? Are they simply located in one person, possessed by one entity, or do they pervade everywhere? How do we even think about that on sort of Buddhist premises? And Zhuangzi becomes useful here. So Tiantai developed that idea, but it developed it in terms of this sort of system that was mainly, you could say, interested in how the union of opposites, in particular value opposites, interpervade. Huayan develops from that, and takes that Huayan Sutra and this motif of interpenetration as its sort of main teaching. It develops them more in a more orderly, systematic way. So you have very nicely worked out arguments in the next few generations in Huayan. But it isn't really focused on this union of the positive and the negative in the same way. It sort of sees that interpenetration itself simply as the positive, as the realm of Buddhahood or enlightenment, and then has a different way of dealing with apparent failures to realize that. So it is a very intricate and beautiful elaboration of the, in my view, of certain key motifs in Tiantai, using sort of different arguments, different sources, and really with a slightly different tilt. And this becomes more and more pronounced as the two traditions develop. So, eventually Tiantai, for example, will say, I know we sound a lot like Huayan, except much messier and less clear, but, the way Huayan does it leaves out something really important, and really for us maybe the most important thing. And so they start to stress a few centuries on this doctrine of evil is inherent in the Buddha nature, which is totally unique to the Tiantai school. And simply as a consequence of this interpenetration, it gets a little complicated about, the ontological status of evil or of negative, states. Are they ultimately, do they interpenetrate with Buddhahood, basically? And does Buddhahood interpenetrate with them? And what does that mean ethically and in terms of Buddhist practice, et cetera? So that value paradoxical side is the side that's especially important for me in sort of drawing out some of these implications of the Taoist legacy. And so I don't write a lot about Huayan. I tend to take the Tiantai side because I think it's philosophically much more interesting and sort of much more radical in the kind of conclusions it will lead to in a very concrete way in terms of sort of on existential level. Because it deals directly, so that ChatGPT suggesting that it's more meditative, it's true. It does have a really intricate methodology of meditation, but partially that's because they will say, for example, Buddhist practice is contemplation of the deluded mind and seeing that the deluded mind itself is identical to Buddhahood, not finding this enlightened substratum and trying to contemplate the true mind, the enlightened mind, even if on some accounts in Mahayana Buddhism, it's original enlightenment, it's always there. We have this in Chan or Zen. We have this in Huayan. So Huayan tends to develop this sort of good only, contemplation of the divine. It's a little more like that. It's not divine, of course, it's Buddhahood, but of the pure, contemplation of the pure as sort of the essence of, I don't know, the solution to the existential dilemma. Whereas Tiantai says, no, you don't need to go away from the finite, from the confused, from the sort of messiness of everyday life and your own neuroses, if to use the modern word. It is those things, not metaphysically distinct and also not like just sort of some aspect of them, but them themselves. And this has really radical consequences, right? And so, when I'm talking about Spinoza and I'm talking about Nietzsche and Bataille in there, I mean, there is this way in which, yes, a kind of infinity is invoked, is crucial, but it's always right into the most sort of contingent and finite and, constrained conditions. And the article you just mentioned about Spinoza, right? The self-overcoming of solipsism, right? You see that, I mean, it's actually a similar figure. You're right. In that article, I didn't feel I had, I mean, I only mentioned the Buddhist stuff in that article sort of in passing as a future thing. And I use the Huayan example of interpenetration because I think it's a little more accessible and a little better known in the West. But it really is that self-overcoming of finitude, being absolutely constrained to our smallness and our contingency and our littleness, and right in that, not in it as if it's an undergirding other thing, like an essence, but the way that actually paradoxically leads beyond itself into the infinite, right? That's what I'm calling mysticism in this book. And it means the full embrace of mortality and finitude and delusion,
Yeah. Well, because I went back to that article on the overcoming of solipsism because I remembered you'd mentioned Huayan, and specifically I pulled up the quote because in the Tao of Physics,
Yeah.
the author mentions that modern quantum physics is starting to catch up to these sort of Eastern philosophies, the Hindu thinking, Buddhist thinking, the Chinese thinking. And then the quote you had in the article from Fajang, am I saying that right?
Yeah.
Fajang says, one small speck of dust pervades all time and places, and yet this one speck of dust and all other phenomena do not know each other or see each other.
Yes.
Now, to me, that sounds very much like quantum entanglement. That 3,000 years ago, quantum physics is just figuring this out today. That you have a particle on the other side of the universe that seems to be entangled with something here. And so that really kind of got me thinking about, like, the point in the Tao of physics, the point you made in the overcoming of solipsism, that yeah, it seems like the ancient Eastern philosophers, whether they're Chinese or Indian or wherever, they seem to have been plugged into the universe intuitively. And we you and I have talked about this offline. That's one of Spinoza's big things, is like the third type of knowledge is intuition. And it almost seems like these Taoist, or these Taoist influenced Chinese Buddhists seem to have this intuition about how the universe worked. That quantum physics is just sort of unraveling today, and that's really what captured me. Like, that's why I love that quote in your article, because it stuck with me. That
Mm.
over 2,000 years ago, like, somebody had this idea that science is just catching up to.
Yeah, it's a complicated question. I mean, I definitely the idea that maybe you put it like this, like, and this is sort of the approach in this book too, is to say, rather than think of this as like a huge discovery, in a way you can think like something really weird happened in the West, which is we got these categories from certain sort of paradigmatic moves in early Greek philosophy that ramify into monotheistic theological thinking, ontotheological thinking, sometimes people call it. And it has this idea that there are just these definite entities with essences, with attributes that work according to this universal, particular, singular sort of schema. And if you don't have that one in place, right, and as speculative thought becomes more sophisticated, in a way, you might think it's sort of natural that the complexity of things, right, and they call it, simple location. Non-simple location is kind of a Whitehead term for this, but this is something you're seeing both in quantum entanglement, right? In a sense, every particle is not just there, right? The idea that there's sort of this hard core of a thing, an atom, right? Atoms are no longer atoms, right? They're supposed to be indivisible little chunks, but very soon, if you investigate them, that falls apart, right? And so the question isn't really, wow, they discovered this amazing thing. In a way, the question is, why did anyone think everything was made up of these discrete little pieces, each of which just sort of owns all its characteristics? I mean, you can look at sort of motivations. I try to do this in the book, right? I'm talking about Plato and this idea of nous as arche. And the idea there's it's actually kind of an ethical motivation. It's this sort of obsessive, purposive pursuit of a single goal, ordering one's behavior around, or orienting completely toward this kind of either or thinking, maybe is the best way to put it, right? Either or thinking got locked into Western philosophy at a very early period. There were alternatives, but they were paths not taken. And then with the advent of monotheistic religion, either or thinking became, the principle of the universe, right? I mean, the idea of a decision and, of course, a last judgment that divides things black and white, right? And what is wanted and what is not wanted. I mean, black and white thinking. So in the absence of those very special moves, in a way, it's sort of natural that you would develop ways of intuiting, it's really neither this way nor that way, right? Now, how do we think about it, right? How do we think about something that is here but has influence over there? The relationship itself, right? Outside of that schema. So in a way, I mean, the West is interesting because it had to imminently overcome those presuppositions. That's one reason I focus so much on Spinoza in this book, is because, he's working entirely within the Western tradition and sort of breaks it, as I put it there, breaks the back of monotheist thinking from within. So which is, quite a hard task, right? He had to sort of think through all these categories, these really theological categories to their breaking point. The Buddhist thinkers were also had an uphill battle in India, I think, because some of those same presuppositions maybe a less virulent form, but some kinds of let's just keep calling it either or thinking, I think have something to do with Indo-European grammar, maybe not in a deterministic way. I've written on this a little bit, but disambiguation as an ultimate fact. That's something that's built into Indo-European grammar that is not built into classical Chinese grammar. And so once that came into China, where you had a kind of process orientation already and a relational cosmology, think about the Book of Changes or some of these Taoist sources, and even the Confucian sources very much emphasize constant creation and relation as really the ultimate categories rather than substance and attributes kind of things. Then in a way, it was when really intense thinking starts going on with these Buddhist monastics, you start to see these incredible, beautiful elaborations of those kinds of an idea. I quoted that one in particular because Fazang there, again, a Huayan thinker, this is a shared idea of Tiantai and Huayan, this idea of that resembles, for whatever reason, does resemble some of these quantum entanglement type of ideas. Bell's theorem, right, I think is the one they always mention. Physicists meant, people who work like on this stuff. Because he also says, yet they don't know, like no two things really know about each other. That's sort of the solipsistic piece that I'm trying to work on there from Spinoza, that in a way, everyone is a self-enclosed world, like a Leibnizian monad in a way. But on the other hand, you take out the Leibnizian God, right, who's giving it the pre-established harmony. And what you have is that harmony is effectuated from within each of those enclosed worlds. And this is what I was trying to get at with that Spinoza paper. It's absolutely finite in a way, but that very absolute finitude is what allows this entanglement of each thing being everywhere, their infinitude. Yeah.
And you do mention, you touched on it just briefly there, and it leads me into my next question. In your book on mystical atheism, you talk about how this monotheistic idea essentially takes over in the West, and that our whole perception is sort of funneled through this lens of monotheism, that there is a creator, that everything has a purpose, but that in China, it went the other way. They never really developed a monotheistic culture. And again, maybe this comes back to the language that you were just mentioning, that the Taoism, this whole Wu Wei, this being and non-being, purpose and non-purpose, that that monotheistic idea really never caught on in China. And I thought that was a really fascinating insight.
Well, it's historically really interesting, and I mean, you'll hear different scholars will have different takes on this, but the way, if you look at the history of ancient Chinese thought, a very interesting phenomenon occurs right around the time when monotheism is really developing, the sort of axial age problem, right? When you're getting like the Hebrew prophets, and you're getting some of the beginnings of Greek proto theological thinking. You have the figure of Confucius, and then you have this school of thought called Moism, and this guy named Mozi, you've probably heard of.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is, there was like in every culture, ancient culture, that especially empire cultures, as you've written about, right? There's there is this idea of this sort of sponsoring deity who's in control of everything. It's pretty vague in China, but there's this thing called Tian, heaven, or before that, the thing called Shangdi. They still use that for the monotheistic God now. The Lord on high kind of is a sponsor of the political dynasty. And then when there's a revolution, this Zhou revolution overthrow, they say, we have the mandate of heaven. this heaven deity, now we're saying heaven in a little more vague, but still kind of anthropomorphic and definitely interested in political outcomes, and morally invested and so on, and indirectly, but still definitely, making interventions in the human world. They had that idea primitively. Confucius comes along, and he has this kind of, respect but keep it at a distance attitude toward traditional religious ideas. He starts to emphasize not the object of the ritual, but the ritual itself, the human ritual, including, sacrifices to spirits and ancestors. The important thing is that you're present, you act as if the deity or the spirit is there. And so it's kind of an agnostic pulling back. Famously, Confucius said, someone asked him about serving spirits. And he said, you cannot yet serve man. How can you serve spirits? They asked him about death. He said, you don't yet understand life. How can you understand death? So you have this kind of move. It's not completed in Confucius, you might say, but this kind of agnostic, at least, or from a later point of view, a de-emphasis on religion and on that tradition. He still wants to invoke heaven now and then, but it's getting more and more rhetorical. And then this guy Mozi shows up, and he says, hey, we got to have a more robust notion of heaven. Heaven has a will, and heaven wants certain things from us. He's all like a prophet, almost, And he says, heaven's will is that we all love each other. Tiantai is the term, or care for each other, more strictly. And he's going to enforce that. And he did, in heaven, created things to serve man. It's this very kind of theistic idea. And also is going to reward and punish people who accord with his will and violate his will. So this was happening all over the world, and it's sort of isomorphic with the development of large states, right? Sovereign states and an imperial system. And we have it in China. But what happens is, because of these little seeds you already get in Confucius, you have a pushback against it that succeeds. And that's in the next great Confucian thinker, Mencius, who argues very strongly against Mozi, against this kind of, interventionist, willful notion of heaven, pushes it way back into the background and gives a different way of understanding the ethical imperatives of Confucianism, but actually emphasizing not law or punishment as Mozi did, because he has a willful God who says, I want this, I don't want that, I'm going to make it happen and not make it happen. The Confucian idea already had this sort of wu-wei notion inside of its concept of ritual, because ritual was a kind of grammar of behavior where you're doing things that you're not really doing deliberately. People respond, In China studies, we often use this example of like a handshake. I stick out my hand, and then sort of magically, wu-wei, your hand comes up. Not because I forced your hand or threatened to punish you, but because we're embedded in this sort of web of relationships that have a common history, that have a sort of a common intertwining that is already built into us. So already in Confucianism, they're contrasting that as sort of the ideal and the universe working more like that than someone making it happen like Mozi thinks. And so really Taoism, in my view, develops that side of a pushback against the theistic, proto-theistic idea of Mozi, an idea that starts in the Confucian idea of ritual, but already in the Tao Te Ching, you have a critique, this idea of ritual, they claim that it's wu-wei, right? That it's all spontaneous, that, the virtuous man just has to do his ritual properly as an emperor, and everyone will just sort of magically fall into line without him having to make laws, without him having to force them. But really, if you think through wu-wei further, you don't even need ritual. In fact, ritual is getting in the way of it, and it's kind of a bogus wu-wei. So I see the whole idea of wu-wei arising from a pushback to this proto-theistic idea. And the interesting thing about China is I think you have this everywhere in the world, but almost everywhere in the world, the theistic side wins, you know? And in China, although it's there, we have a double pushback, a Confucian pushback, and then even more radically, a Taoist pushback. And these become the dominant strains of the culture. So I always think of Moz as kind of like an inoculation of theism, you know? It's like a vaccine, right? They had this little pathogen that came in, and then suddenly these antibodies, right? The antibodies are the developed Confucian and much more so the Taoist systems. And once those were there, when Buddhism came in, it was already an atheistic system, of course, right? But they were able to develop that side that, you know, didn't become even really onto-theological to a great sort of pinnacle of thinking.
And the coolest insight that I took away from your explanation in the book between the Taoist concepts versus the theist concepts was this idea of purpose and non-purpose. That purpose, by its definition, is mutually exclusive of non-purpose.
Yes.
But non-purpose, by its definition, includes purpose as one of its subsets. And that was one of the most fascinating takeaways for me from your book, was just that shift in thinking that I never even thought of it in that way before. And it was quite eye-opening to think of it in those terms.
I'm very glad to hear that. Yeah, I think that's such a key idea, you know, and I mean, I mean, easily overlooked. And you know, I mean, the idea is that seems to, you know, after working in Taoist texts and Chinese texts, and you go back to look at Western philosophy, you really are shocked at like how soaked in God ideas it is. I mean, even before, you know, I mean, even the ancient Greeks are talking about gods in plural all the time. And very quickly with Socrates and Plato and Aristotle on, you get this sort of single ordered cosmos. And they're all at pains to demonstrate that, you know, what from a Taoist perspective, you suddenly realize like, this means that the whole universe is Yo-Wei, is deliberate. We have a universe that is run according to ideals, according to the good, or according to God's will, right? That someone or something is supposed to be in control. And the nature of that, as you know, from, you know, I get this from reading the Taoist text, like if you put Wu-Wei in the sort of ultimate position, you're going to get all kinds of purpose, like, and many purposes, diverse purposes, right? Alternate purposes, which all relate through this sort of they're meeting in this indeterminate point of purposelessness that they all share, right? Which is their substratum or their source, which pervades them, but also enables them. So it is, as you said, it's a both and proposition. If the ultimate horizon of being is purposeless, you don't lose purpose that way. In fact, you get purpose. It's just always interconnected with purposelessness. But that really is a bridge just to other purposes, right? More purposes. You could say more purpose. But it seems once you're sort of accustomed to thinking that way, and you go back to look at, you know, this idea that things, not just that purposes arise and perish, but there's one purpose for all things, and that's the ultimate kind of ontological explanation for the world, locks you in, because as you said, by its definition, by its very nature, a purpose is an endeavor to exclude whatever does not accord with itself, with that purpose. So you have a dualistic structure built in to the notion of the purpose, and if you make that ontologically and metaphysically ultimate, you have a cosmos that is going to end up locked into this kind of either or thinking at every level, you know.
Right. Yeah. And you mentioned a few minutes ago, you mentioned like why this whole idea of the atom, like that things should be made of this. And then you just mentioned Socrates. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with David Sedley of Cambridge University.
Yeah.
In one of his books, I think it was for
Creation.
Creationists in Antiquity, he talks about that Socrates develops the first argument from design specifically to refute Democritus and his atomism.
Yes.
And then, I'm sure you're familiar with Spinoza's letter 56, where he says Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle don't mean anything to me.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's huge, right? That is such a huge breakthrough. Yeah, I lean very heavily on Sedley's book, that book in this book, and precisely that in the Phaedo, when Socrates is about to die, he says, I heard this Anaxagoras, someone reading a book of Anaxagoras saying, mind is the origin of all things, nous is the arche. And I thought, finally, Socrates is speaking, right? I finally found what I'm looking for, someone who can tell me that the reason things are as they are is because a mind put them there, the mind, or mind per se. And that means everything will be what it is because it's good, because that's what minds do. They arrange things according to their purposes, right? So whatever it considers good, that's what it'll arrange. So then he says, so why is the sky blue? Because it's better for it to be blue, right? Why do we walk upright? Because, the mind, the big mind, thought it's good, okay? And specifically against ideas of chance and the atomist idea, and the one I particularly am interested in the book that Sedley brings up, right, is this idea of infinity as a power, which the Epicureans, especially the later Roman atomist inheritors, develop as really a positive force, right? There's this idea that given randomness and infinite time and expanse, every possible configuration will take shape. And so when you're looking at an orderly system, you're sort of looking at an embodiment of that force of infinity. There's a term isonomia, right? Equal distribution, which means that, you don't need a special principle to create order out of chaos. You just need enough chaos, if you like. You just need the real infinity. You really need to take in infinity. And one more thing I'll just add on this, after working in Chinese materials for so long, I found it so astonishing. I just said, well, when you go back to Greek materials, you're like, God, they're really obsessed with gods and God and, the divine as these agents who are doing things, right? Whether at the ultimate source or just to explain natural phenomena. It's really not a big part of Chinese philosophical discourse at all, at the written elite level at least. But the other big thing that you notice when you go back and forth between these traditions is there's this ancient Greek terror of apeiron, meaning the formless, right? Or infinity, the unbounded, the boundless. Because they have this thought that, something that is boundless is basically chaos, that it has no articulation, it has no individual being. So you're thinking like a statue, not articulated well enough kind of thing, right? So if something doesn't have clear boundaries, it is basically, it's almost the very definition of evil. This is not true of all the pre-Socratics, but once you get to Socrates, and Plato and Aristotle, Spinoza's nemesis there, they start to think infinity. The only word they have for infinity is this boundlessness, and it's really, the very antithesis of order. Now, there's a complicated story how, in monotheistic thinking, they are trying. It's already starting with Anaxagoras, but there's a kind of workaround Statue of Liberty play where they have to connect this originally very antipathetic idea of infinity with an ordering principle, and it's even now you read these books on Spinoza, you'll see people very perplexed. How does you get from infinity to finite modes or to orderly, seemingly law-abiding concepts? And of course, the theological answer is, well, you got to make that infinity a kind of mind itself, an infinite mind. And then you have everything that follows from that. That really absolutizes the dichotomous thinking that was always part of the anti-infinity concept of mind as the origin. That's the story I'm trying to tell in that book.
So if they're afraid of this boundlessness, the sunyata would have scared the hell out of them. So
Exactly. And of course, you find exactly the opposite if you go over into the Chinese text too, right? I mean, you have this idea of we translate nothing, right? But it really means formless, having no definite contours or limits. And this is viewed as sort of the source of being, right? This is where all forms emerge from, and which they must retain contact with to remain vital and interconnected with the other forms. You need that. The Tao Te Ching chapter 11, right, has this image of the spokes of a wheel joined by their hub, which is an empty hole. And it's only because it's empty, because there's nothing, no form, nothing that can exclude anything else, that all these wheels can come together and form a coherent wheel, right? So you need the nothingness, the unbounded, the indefinite, in order to make the definite work.
So just we've been talking for about an hour now, so we should probably wrap up. So, a lot of what the book about, like this mystical atheism, it's about finding your purpose in a purposeless universe. So, we have people like Jordan Peterson, and I saw your podcast with Professor Mueller, and you guys I think you guys referred to him as our friend Jordan. And he's got his maps of meaning, but Taoism is really all about this non-meaning, this purposelessness. So, any thoughts on Jordan Peterson's theistic attempts to try to shove meaning down people's throats?
Yeah. Professor Mueller has had a little run-in with Jordan Peterson, an online argument that was sort of feeding into. And that was largely about the way Peterson sort of endorses sovereign individuality and, kind of an existential view of embracing purpose, very deliberate way, but also, yes, prioritizing meaning as sort of this ultimate horizon. And in the book, I sort of distinguish between two different responses to atheism, right? One is, I call compensatory atheism, and there I would put these, one response to the meaninglessness and the purposelessness of the universe is sort of the Voltaire response, right? At the end of Candide, we have the famous line, right? We must cultivate our garden. And that is to say, because the world is purposeless, or Jean-Paul Sartre, let's say, right, has this idea, we must create purpose and firmly commit resolutely to that purpose and sort of make our own destiny. And that's one response to atheism, right? And it weirdly is consonant with one response to theism, which is to say God has a purpose. We should come to know that purpose and work single-mindedly to attain that purpose to the exclusion of all else. And, part of the point there is that whether you think of that theistically or atheistically, it's still rooted in the theistic prioritization of a single ultimate purpose as the only form of value. Right. And as sort of a self-standing kind of value. So even if it still means the only thing we should care about is sort of controlling events so that a purpose, whether we think it's from us or from God, is fulfilled. You could address this to technology in general too. And so in my mind, that doesn't yet really get us out of the circle of the dominance of monotheistic thinking, even in its atheistic form, And Jordan Peterson is interesting because, of course, he's very cagey about, and less so now, I think, right? But, do you believe in God? Well, what do you mean by that?
What do you mean by God?
Yeah. So he clearly wants, and it's true, it doesn't matter that much in his case, because what really matters is he thinks it would be a good thing if God existed, and that at least it's a good thing for us to think that God exists and behave as if God exists, right? And even if you flipped that to the atheist side, he's still, this is, I think, Professor Mueller's beef with him is, he still maintains this myth of this sort of atomistic individual, which is a model of sort of a mini God, this sort of absolute free will, take charge of your life, model of responsibility is ultimate. And of course, nobody's against that stuff, right? I mean, taking action or pursuing your goals or anything like that. The question is whether you put that into this kind of fanatically absolutized position where it becomes the sole standard and horizon of all judgment and value, right? And because this is what I'm trying to argue, at least, is, when that happens, when it clicks out of being sort of a contingent and coexisting form of thing, that I have a purposive side that emerges from and is permeated by this other purposelessness dimension that allows it to interface with all these things, but non-exclusively, right? And I there are times and places and aspects of myself and my activity that are not going to be put into under the control, this one-sided fanatical control of this one idea, this fixed idea. And that is actually my argument, the sort of carrying through the Taoist argument. That's what actually gives value to the pursuit of purposes, to that which can be achieved by them, which is what they can then do in relation to unexpected or underdeveloped or alternate aspects of the world or of the self or of others. So it's this kind of strangulation that's built into the very concept of purpose as ultimate that Jordan Peterson, theistic thinking is very resourceful. Every generation, you've studied the history of the church and you've studied the history of sort of Enlightenment ideas. And of course, one thing you see there is that in every generation, let's say in Europe, Christianity always manages to align itself with the latest intellectual trend, find a way to justify itself, right? Try to sort of reestablish it. First it was Neoplatonist and then it was Aristotelian. And, you get into the modern times, it's Marxist, socialist. No, it's existentialist. No, it's postmodern, right? I mean, the God idea is this sort of shapeshifter, but my argument at least is like when it's a weird kind of forgive the I was going to say sort of like a retrovirus. It's a thing which knows how to utilize, adapt, right, and even take over the immune system, which whatever kind of immune system. I mean, like an alternate ideology always arises to try to sort of break out of it. And then you will find it, it sort of creeps back in and then is sort of co-opted. And then you got to get another one. No, we didn't go radical enough. We got to do, this other paradigm shift. And then you'll get Christians saying, that's what Christianity was all along. It's happening now. That's why Muller and I did that thing about Zizek's, Christian atheism. Oh yeah, okay, atheism, right? That's what Christianity was all along. It was like a first step to atheism, But what happens there, what we're trying to argue is that, but that atheism, just like Jordan Peterson's like pseudo-atheism, pseudo-theism, whatever it is, it's just we're not getting at like the fundamental issue, which in my view at least is this purposivity as ultimate issue, and Peterson like really doubles down on that, and Muller's is funny, he gave a nice video on him, it's also about style, because if you watch that stuff, it's that prophetic style, like, Jacques, right? Like you must be this sort of fiery prophet denouncing the corruption and the decline of the turpitude of the world. This is something you don't see at all. Again, that's another thing you notice when you study Chinese materials, right? That style of ethical discourse, that either or style, again, you find it in Mozi, and it links to his proto-theism, I think, right? Like, this is right, this is wrong, what you're doing is wrong, end of story. And I must stand here and denounce it. The Confucians even, right, will say, that is counterproductive. That is a violent way of opposing violence. You don't do it that way. You just become an exemplar of the thing, right? And the very idea of like, shaking your fist at what is wrong is itself even more wrong. So this is the thing, you find you have these complicated defenses and this caginess about does God exist or not? I'm not like some naive theist. Yeah, but the structure, right? The ethos, is still completely dominating this discourse. That's the idea.
Right. Yeah, my take on Peterson, it took me. So a friend of mine who's also a philosophy professor, he sent me the back in 2018 Peterson's biblical series, and I'm like, I started watching. I'm like, he's a Gnostic. He's not a real Christian. He's preaching Jungian Gnosticism, but he never
Yeah,
admits to his audience that that's what he's doing. So,
yeah, yeah.
um,
Oh, and I mean,
just
yeah, sure. And the hermeneutic sort of method is so kind of, I mean, I have no objection to anyone reading whatever they want to reading into any text, but the problem with that, I mean, it's so obviously arbitrary and biased the way he's choosing. You just know in advance he's going to read every crazy ass story from the Bible as another illustration, and you could do that, of course, with any text, right? As an illustration of, yes, I agree with you. It is this Jungian Gnosticism. I mean,
yeah.
he is avowedly Jungian, I think, but
For sure. But he never admits in any way because he's got transcripts and I text search through every single episode. He
yeah,
never once admits that he's pushing Jungian Gnosticism.
yeah,
So
yeah,
and his interpretations, like my biggest criticism of his biblical series is he completely ignores the context and his psychological evaluation of the meaning of the stories is completely wrong. Like I mean, you yourself, Eastern philosophies. My biggest issue with him, he was talking about the Garden of Eden story and
yeah.
the serpent and relating it to Satan. I'm like, no, the concept of Satan as the serpent, that's a Christian interpretation. That is not original in Judaism. And on top of that, the story comes from the Epic of Gilgamesh, like
Yeah,
from 3500 BCE. So it's like 2,000 years older than the Hebrew tradition.
yeah, yeah.
Um, and Joseph Campbell makes a really excellent point, and you will know this that the serpent in Eastern cultures is positive. It
Oh,
sheds its skin. It's a symbol of rebirth.
yes,
Like that there's that famous picture of Buddha with the cobra,
right, right,
sheltering him,
absolutely.
and Peterson completely misses all of this context to
Oh yeah,
push his narrative, and
oh
like that
yeah.
was my yeah.
Yeah, and it's a great point because, like, it's not. Of course, someone who interprets like that is going to say, as religious interpreters have for centuries, right? Well, the historical meaning is the historical meaning. We're not interested in that. This has a deep spiritual other meaning, and that's what we are sort of uniquely qualified to excavate. But the problem is, even in terms of the text, right? Even in terms of the way the text, just if you just look at the text and knew nothing about the history, the readings are incredibly, as you say, like non-contextual. You don't look at what are the premises in the narrative of what's going on here. Of course, they're all interpreted, as sort of positive life lessons, of profound significance, right? So it is ridiculous. I mean, there that stuff in the biblical interpretation is just like, is just beyond that, above and beyond his general kind of positions as a public intellectual or whatever. That stuff is just so cringeworthy,
Yeah.
like feeble.
Yeah,
But
and I accused him in my deconstruction of his series. I accused him of lying by omission because it's
yeah,
clear from watching his biblical series. It's clear he's done his homework. It's clear he knows the Sumerian origins of a lot of these biblical stories. He never once connects the dots. And I said, dude, you're lying by omission. You
yeah,
know what's going on here, and you're burying the lead. And
yes, of
sorry,
course, because
that's just dishonest.
it's dishonest, but he thinks he's doing it in the service of the good, right? Because he thinks this is an intervention that can save the crisis of Western civilization by restoring its, commitment to these particular religious motifs. So, any by any means necessary, I guess, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he really thinks he's doing the Lord's work, if you like.
Yeah, I actually,
Whether
I
he
put it
whether
in.
he means that figuratively or literally, we don't know. But
Yeah,
one way or
Like
another.
me being the smart ass that I am, I was like, how Freud would think, like, paging Dr. Freud, can you figure out why Peterson is like being so cagey? So,
Yeah, yeah.
okay.
He think he's a preacher basically, right? I mean, he's an apologist, so he wants to say these myths are the root of our culture, and our culture is awesome, and we
Yeah.
must at all costs
And
revitalize.
he's recently just done an Exodus series that is so cringeworthy. It's sponsored by Ben Shapiro's company, so that tells you off right off the bat.
Yeah,
But just I watched the first episode and it was just the whole thing was cringeworthy. It was just
yeah,
mind-numbingly just insipid.
yeah,
So
yeah.
anyway, so if you've got maybe just 5 more minutes, I would love to. So your book is on mystical atheism and the
Sure.
experiences of mystical atheism. So was there something in you that you wanted to talk about
Hmm.
these non-religious mystical experiences? Because as you like, we'll talk about it like offline, and we don't want to get into it here, but this mystical experience of tapping into the infinity that we were talking about earlier. So was there something specific to you that you wanted to write about a non-religious mystical experience?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, and I sort of very briefly touch on this in the first few pages of the book, but I mean, as I reflected on why I got so involved in this topic, I did think about, I have, I think as a young person, as an adolescent, I was very curious, and the sort of main issue is a feeling of sort of confinement, or limitation in the sort of single system of meanings and horizons of possibility that what I felt was being communicated to me about the world. So I was very interested in all kinds of philosophical and religious texts that would somehow expand my sense of what is or could be or should be or can be. And so, at this stage, instead of doing my homework, that's why we started this conversation. I randomly pulled out a book called Tao Te Ching. What the hell is that? Oh, this is different. It was just something other, something that could reconfigure my experience of of my world, But I kept coming across early on, before that Tao Te Ching discoveries, like, they had all these like really interesting different ideas from what I was being taught, just about what life is about, like what the world is about, right? There's just this sort of very constrained set of facts and goals, and anything that was an alternative to that interested me. But in every case, when I was reading, European materials, very soon there'd be some invocation, explicitly or implicitly, of this God thing. And I noticed that, wow, that just ruined the whole expansive effect that was motivating me to investigate and learn and try to master this kind of material, because you suddenly had this picture of a closed universe guided by some being's intention, some consistent set of desiderata. So, and yet I had, I would say, a kind of a very mystical or religious disposition. I was not, a dreamy kid, who was disconnected a little bit, a little alienated from my environment, and very eager and very kind of had a sort of propensity to elaborate alternate systems. So if I would read, it's like science fiction, right? Or like you read these you just mentioned these Gnostic systems, some of these really weird systems, alternate pictures of the world really excited me, right? And I wanted to think about all the implications. What would it be like if that were true? Wow, that would mean when I do this is the case, blah, blah, blah. That is a very liberating experience. And I mean, it wasn't until much later that on a theoretical level I could understand, well, what is it about finitude and infinity and the way these things are related to each other that, what are you really seeking when you seek liberation in this sense, right? Of course, and learning Buddhism and learning Daoism, learning how systematically these sort of ideas were explored came much later. But initially there was that feeling, and I just always felt the what I would call my non-secular goals, okay, my mystical religious goals, far from being aided by any conception of God. I mean, let alone the Bible or the Quran. I mean, when I looked at those, like, this is like the world I'm trying to get away from, but worse. This is a self-enclosed, locked in, planned community, right? Like a gated community, but now it's the whole universe, So it just seemed that those were at odds to me. And when I finally did discover non-theistic religious system, it was a real eye-opening, that, the real essence of what, to me, why do I always go to the religion section in the bookshop or the library? Why do these books interest me so much? But the second they have anything to do with God, the effect is completely reversed. Well, it turns out, there's a lot to think through in there. What is boundlessness, infinity, finitude? What is the relation between the two? And I discovered have been for thousands of years people who have thought very deeply about these things and had experiences similar to the ones I would occasionally get a glimpse of. And of course, you reported this in reading, right? I would get those experiences as I started to read and understand more, like we just mentioned, Indra's net, the interpervasion, quantum entanglement type of idea in Buddhist scripture, or the sort of ultimate horizon of non-doing in Taoism, the coursing of Tao, things like that, which, and then I saw, of course, when you get into the discourse, the scholarly discourse about these things, there's this very unfortunate, tendency to try to, because they're all religion or so all have this blanket term put on them, to assimilate those somehow to theistic ways of thinking. So, you hear people say, like, well, China, they don't have the word Tao, God, but they have Tao, and it's sort of like the same thing, but a slightly different angle or something. I really want to push back against that hard, because that's why in the book, I have a section provocatively titled "The Discovery of the Opposite of Tao." I mean, the opposite of God. Discovery of the opposite of God, Taoism. That's where I do discuss the Tao Te Ching. And I mean, I'm trying to say there, in a very important sense, yeah, sure, Tao and the concept of God in their respective cultural spheres play some of the same roles, but those are insignificant compared to the fact that they are, in their essence, almost diametric opposites, because God signifies the ultimacy, ontologically, ethically, metaphysically, of purpose, and Tao represents the ultimacy of purposelessness in all those domains. Right. So,
yeah. And I was thinking, when you mentioned, I mentioned the Gnostics, then you mentioned it. It tweaked for me just about a week or two ago when I was reading through your one of your appendices. The thought occurred to me that these mystical connections to infinity, like there's the stray, like as you mentioned, like, is this what the Gnostics were experiencing? Like that they were contemplating infinity and having these mystical experiences. And so in the research, as I mentioned to you offline, I've been making all of these notes. One of the things I've done is collate some research, psychological research that has been done onto these mystical experiences, like comparing, like, what are the similarities, what are the differences. So I'll be diving into that later, but it was interesting. So
excellent. Yeah. And I'm sorry, go ahead.
And I mentioned to you, so for the viewers, so as Brooke knows, I was actually reading one of Brooke's writings. It was actually his Appendix A, number 11, Europe's Missed Exit to Atheism. And in that, he was discussing, Hegel was discussing Spinoza's concepts of infinity. And I think why it was stuck in my head is because I was actually reading it on the plane coming back from Hong Kong. And that passage that I shared with you, that's when I had to close my laptop because we were landing. And so that particular thing about Hegel trying to get his head around infinity was in my subconscious percolating when I had my own mystical experience where I finally understood why in your overcoming of the self overcoming of solipsism, where Spinoza taught that the three kinds of knowledge that Spinoza talks about, and the third one being intuition. It was like I suddenly get it. It's like my eyes were open. I got intuition. I understood how your brain, when you have that mystical experience, you just understand something that previously, like the written word is just very esoteric, and you're like, okay, I how do.
Yes.
And then when you have that experience, like I describe it as that third eye opening, that you just grasp it now intuitively. That something that a concept I was struggling with, and now I can just see it.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Oh yeah, I know. It's so important. I mean, and that idea of intuition in Spinoza, right? I mean, it is, yeah, where there aren't steps anymore. As you say, it's seeing that something that you may have sort of understood discursively or struggled to understand, or you have to put these parts together and link them. But there is this kind of aha moment where they're you suddenly see it's sort of a tautology that of course this is that, or that this thing, that this laborious sentence on the page, or this formula he uses, a mathematical example, was trying to explain is and is a sort of short circuit, like it was there in the premise all along. It's an analytic proposition in technical language, or it's really a tautology. The synthetic, the seemingly huge claim made, well, because this, then this, and you're doing this sort of tinker toy of reasoning, but they sort of collapse into a single point, right? And you see all those sides are really just one thing, right? Yeah.
It was a great experience. Like it was just so, and as I mentioned to you in my email, it's just I was consciously aware that I was having this experience and that this experience would be finite. Like I knew, like, I'm gonna get yanked back into reality any
Yeah.
second now. And I'm
Yeah.
totally conscious of all this while I'm in this sort of transcendent experience of contemplating infinity and eternity. And it was really, really cool. I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
one of the things that got me about, like, in reading the Tao of Physics, um, he's saying, oh, like, these mystics train for years with masters to learn how to accomplish this. And I'm like, well, I just read a paragraph in Brooks' book, and I was just lying in bed thinking about it, and it just happened. Uh,
Yeah. Well, this is the
so
great thing about philosophical. I'm of course, nothing could make me happier than to hear that could come from, because that's the experience I get reading Spinoza or Zhuangzi or Tiantai texts. Like, yeah, it can be done. I mean, if it hits you right, and you have a written text and you're disposed to that kind of thinking, it's the best, right? That's the best thing.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's like that. Wow, I never thought of it that way before. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
The
and but
whole
that's I grasped. I
changes.
just totally got Spinoza's third type of knowledge, intuition. Like it instantly made sense. Like before, it was just some esoteric concept
Yeah.
that's being described. But now I get it.
Right. You're at the source
Yeah,
that you can see them struggling to put this into words by looking at this thing, right, that they're describing, right? And it's like, to describe it requires all these seemingly complicated connections and things. It's really incredibly simple,
yeah,
single multi-dimensional thing that happens all at once.
yeah. And I don't want to give away what you and I are talking about offline. I don't want to give away the ending, but yeah, I can see now how some of this applies to what you and I have been talking about, and like how I can use that to frame
Mm,
what we want to do, and make it meaningful to others. So
excellent.
yeah,
Yes.
great. Okay, well, it's been about 90 minutes, so I'm sure you have work to do. So, and I'm sure my wife would like to get me back.
And
Um,
it's what time is it there? You're
it's almost midnight,
yeah.
so it's midnight's about the time for me to actually start working, because that's when my brain starts kicking
No,
in
yeah.
and like all these ideas start coming to me. And so,
I used to
yeah,
be like that. That's well, most of my books were written in that state, but it's
yeah,
gradually shifted to the morning.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to conclude with one Taoist maxim that I think our viewers would probably appreciate is the Taoist maxim of the three great mysteries of life: air to the bird, water to the fish, mankind to himself. And that's what Brook is trying to expound in his writings on mystical atheism. And again, the links, I'll put the links in the description to his book, to his webpage at the University of Chicago, where you can find some of his materials, specifically the one I just mentioned, Appendix A, Europe's Missed Exit to Atheism was a really cool read. It's the one that actually triggered the mystical experience for me. There were other great, his Appendix B, as I mentioned to him offline, his Appendix B, which is also on his webpage, was just full of some really, really great information. I mentioned earlier about the Tiantai and the Lotus Sutra. Reading his deconstruction of the Lotus Sutra through the eyes of the transcendent experience that I had had a few weeks ago was just like, wow, like this Lotus Sutra is describing exactly what I experienced. So yeah,
Oh man,
so
it's so
check it
great.
out, guys.
Yeah,
Okay.
and Jason, thanks. I'm glad. We've been corresponding for a long time. This is the first time we've actually spoken, and it was great. I'm really glad to have had the opportunity to talk through some of this stuff with you.
Yeah, it was great. I hope the viewers love it. I hope we can inspire one or two people to pick up a book on Taoism and maybe expand their knowledge a little bit. And yeah, there'll be more coming in the future. We've Brooke and I we're working on a couple of things. We wanna try to take this idea of meaninglessness and a purposeless life, and how that can apply to people who might be struggling. As Jordan Peterson's with his maps of meaning, and we're trying to look at a way we can make you know people have their own mystical experience
Yes,
of life and infinity and
yes.
calm.
Maybe to become maps out of meaning, right?
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Brooke. I'm sure you've got some work to do. It's the middle of the day for you. So it was great chatting with you. I hope everyone loved the experience. Again, check out the links, check out the description. There'll be some links in there, and we'll see everybody on the next one. Take care. Bye bye.
Right.
Thanks for watching. Please check out the other videos on my channel if history is your thing, and see you next time.